fresh pedals. There's something magical about them, isn't there? But using a wonderful refresh kit just like this, we can make your older pedals feel just like new again. Here's how. Pedals, be those clips or flats, see the trail very differently from, well, you or I. And that's because they're really close to the ground. So they're going through all the swamps, all the bogs, all the trail, all the rocks, all the stumps, almost literally in some cases, which isn't really tremendous. And looking after your pedals is really important. All our body weight and all our power goes through them, crank after crank. We're going to use our partners, Crankbrothers, to show you how to refresh your pedals. Before we enter the pedal spa, I've just got a little favour to ask, and that's if you can just like and subscribe to the channel and to these videos. It really helps us make good content just like this. Welcome to Pedal Spa. Lots of different pedals have got different levels of, well, service kits and maintenance kits. Crankbrothers, but we're really lucky to have them as a partner because they give you, well, refresh kits with all the bearings that you need, but they also can give you fresh axles as well. So if you've bent an axle or you're wanting to try a different Q factor, so the length of axle away from the crank, you can do that. It will depend on which pedal you've bought in terms of which service kit you need. And if you've not got Crankbrothers, you might need to do a little bit more research into which pedal bearing refresh kit you'll need. Depending on what pedals you've got, you are going to need some different tools, but all of these tools should be useful for a pedal service. So let's run through what you'll need. Well, you'll need a 6mm, that's for the end cap. You'll need an 8mm, that's to get it off the crank. You'll need, well, an 8 and 10mm socket, that's for one of the nuts on the inside. I'm going to use this handy Y tool, but you might have sockets, for example, which can work as well. Got a couple there. Obviously you need a driver for those sockets. Other thing that you'll probably need is a T25 tool. That for the Crankbrothers is to separate the pedal bodies. You'll need, well, you can get away with one pick tool, but I've got the option of 2 pick tools, and you'll need these to fish out little bits inside and make sure that seals are seated correctly. So 2 of those. Other stuff you'll need: a hammer. You'll also need a drift tool, and you'll be like, what's a drift tool? Well, you need not worry, because Crankbrothers provide one in their refresh kit. So the refresh kit is also very helpful. It's got all the spares that you need. So you've got the cartridge bearings, you've got the IGUS bearing, you've got the external double lip seal, the external outer seal, and then on the inside of the pedal, which we'll show you later, there's also sort of a top hat bearing assembly and seals as well. All of those are in that kit. Other stuff that you're going to need: cloth to wipe stuff down, some degreaser to clean the pedals to start with and to clean them as we go through it. And then we're going to need grease. Okay, I'm being fancy because PTs do 2 different greases. They do a speed grease, which is great for bearings and things that rotate. And they also use an assembly grease, which is what I'll use on other sections. And I'll explain why I'm using 2 different greases. You don't have to go to those levels, but I can, and I will. I'm fortunate and I've refreshed quite a lot of these Crankbrothers pedals in the past, so I know the innards inside out. But if you're working on something new, exploded diagrams are a really good idea. Crankbrothers has got a full list and a full exploded diagram for pretty much all its pedals, but lots of other brands too, so it's worthwhile before we start taking this apart to know what we're going to look at. So try and find one of those exploded diagrams for your pedal before we get too deep in the pedal. To start our teardown of this Crankbrothers pedal, we're going to take the end cap out. And depending on which model you've got, you might have a hex key like this one, which is quite simple to take out. You might have a flathead screwdriver head. They can be a little bit more stubborn, but don't worry if you write it off, because in the refresh kit, you get new end caps. Happy days. Okay, now we're going to take our 8mm. We've got this Y tool, but you might need a socket and wrench. Basically, just make sure it's snug. I would say just be mindful that some 8mm sockets from other brands of kind of wrenches can be really fat on here, and you just won't be able to get it in. Don't be tempted to use anything other than a socket, because you won't be able to get the pedal off unless you do. So socket in there. Then we're using the tool, the 8mm that we use to take it off the crank, to balance that out. Just slot that in there, and then we should just be able to break it apart. There we go. So this is a nylock nut, so sometimes you might need to give it a little bit of beans to get it off. So the other thing that can happen, so just be mindful, is that the nut can get stuck in there. Don't worry, because you've got fresh nylock nuts in the refresh kit. With the nut off the end, we're going to pull out the axle. Just be mindful that these pedals have 2 seals on the end, so we should be able to get both out at the same time with a bit of jiggery pokery. Oh, okay, perfect. These are a little bit crusty. We've still got some fresh grease. We've also got some muddy grease. And you might be wondering, well, there's 2 lip seals there. That should be sealing everything off. Well, they do a lot. I think a big problem is that lots of people get trigger happy with jet washes and blast really high pressure water around these seals. And if we'd got any pedal, not just a Crankbrothers one, that had a seal that could survive a direct jet washer blast, well, it'd be really hard to pedal and it'd be really inefficient to spin as well. So just staying on top of refreshing your pedals and giving them a clean can really help in this process. So with the axles off, time to make a little waste basket. So we'll take the seals off. They're not too bad. And if you've got any surface rust, if it's just light, don't worry too much about it. If it is really bad and it's worn a groove into the pedal axle, again, don't worry, you can get spare axles, especially with these Crankbrothers ones. So we're going to clean it up. We need a little bit of degreaser to help us. These actually look really good, which is great. I'm looking at the bearing seat on this end, so the opposite from the crank side, and I'm looking at this bearing seat here, and both of those look really good. Obviously your pedals will differ. Keep that safe because the axle we'll need again. These are the Mallet E Enduros from Crankbrothers, and the pedal body, as you can see from the 2 colours, comes apart, and that makes servicing a lot easier. Your pedals might be different, but for me, I'm going to start with a T25 and split the pedal body. With the Crankbrothers pedal design, you've got this inner wing assembly, and yeah, it's going to stick one side or the other of the 2 halves. Just pop that apart, give it a quick inspect. If it's particularly crusty on the inside or on the outside, time to give it another clean. But this one looks okay, so we'll just put it to one side. That wing assembly in the centre sleeve slides on some bearings, and that's the next thing we're going to get out. So we're going to pop those bolts out of the way. Again, make sure that you put the pedal body bolts somewhere safe because you need to pull those pedals back in. We're going to use our pick tool, and we're just going to carefully lift. There's a small top hat, and then there's an inner ring O-ring seal underneath, and we're going to pop both of those out now. So the top hat and the O-ring, you get fresh ones, but do make a kind of like mental note that there's 2 different sizes of these little top hat bushings. So there's one that's slightly deeper than the other, and the one that's deeper sits next to the crank, so crank side. So yeah, if you need to make a mental note for that when you're rebuilding it, mental note time now. With the Mallet E's, we've got this extra piece here, which we just need to carefully work out. Again, they're specific for each side of the pedal, so one left, one right. So if you're going to just service the pedals left and right, we're okay, they'll fit in. But if you're doing both pedals at once, make sure that you keep each bits to one side. Time to take out that small bushing and that O-ring again. We can see the bearings much more easily now. We've got an Igus bushing on the crank side, and then the outside of the pedal, we've got an Enduro cartridge bearing. We're going to need a drift tool that comes with the refresh kit to poke those out. Next task. With the pedal bearing on the outside of the pedal, we've got enough space in the pedal body to use the drift tool with the pedal body on the mat. So just be mindful that if you've got something sticking up that fits in there, that means that as you're hitting and drifting this bearing out, if it's an impedance and stops that, well, as you hammer away, you could be damaging the pedal. So make sure that there's enough space for that bearing to be able to drift all the way through. So we're going to set it up as such. Make sure that this drift is set up vertically, so don't catch the edge that's in there. It's really important, that edge, and we need it for later. So balance that there. Should come out with a couple of clean blows. Or just one. Now it's time to do the crank side bearing removal. So this is an Igus bushing. It's quite deep. Here's one here to show how deep it is, and we don't have enough room in the pedal body to actually drift it all the way out, so we need a little bit of support. We're going to use a 14mm open socket wrench, so we can just pop that just there, and then we're going to use the drift tool again just to drift it through. And again, it's really important that we've got enough space for this Igus bearing, okay, the one that's fitted into the pedal body, to be able to drift all the way through and out. We've removed the bearing. Just make sure that the seat of the bearing is all clean. This one has got a nice layer of grease on, so it came out really smoothly, but just do a little bit of an inspection, and we're going to clean it up, ready for those fresh bearings. our process was very straightforward, but I have had it in the field where, because someone's abused their pedal and not replaced bearings and seal kits when they should have, that this igus is quite stubborn. There's a lot of contact area with the pedal body, and sometimes the drift tool here can just start to catch an edge and slide through. So if that starts to happen, before you just keep bashing away needlessly and ruining the chance of getting the bearing out, if you just give the drift tool a little bit of an angle and then tap through, just be careful that you're not damaging the pedal body, but that should give you enough of an edge to drift this out. Grease is grease, right? No. There's lots of different greases for lots of different applications. PT has got 3. They've got a suspension one, they've got this assembly one, which we're going to use now, and they've got a faster rolling speed grease. So if you're going to reassemble your bearings, these ones are from Enduro, so I know that they've got a really high fill rating, but if you're getting your bearings from just a generic place, you may need to pop these lip seals off and fill them with more grease. It's not necessary to actually grease this part, but from lots of experiences in the field fixing lots of pedals, I find it works really well. So we're just going to squirt a little bit in there and then work it around. So the grease helps because it helps retain the O-ring, and then it helps kind of seal all of that grease into that part of the pedal, especially when you put the inner bearing, inner sleeve on top. Now we've greased that area for the inner wing assembly, we're going to pop the O-rings in and make sure that we put the correct little top hat structure. So there's 2 different lengths. The taller one sits on the crank side and the skinnier one sits on the outside of the pedal. So just make sure that you're fitting the right one on the right part, because we're doing one pedal at a time, and we don't want it to get to when you're doing the other pedal and you realise that you haven't got the right parts, because some of them won't fit in the right places. Now for the fun bit, we're going to press the bearings in. Well, just before we do, we're going to make sure that we've got a nice layer of grease on where the igus slide bearing goes in and where the bearing goes in. So your pedal setup might be different and you might be rebuilding a different pedal, but make sure that there's a nice layer of grease on the outside of the bearing. You might be wondering why that bit doesn't really spin, or shouldn't spin. And you're right, it's purely for when you refresh the pedals again, that because there isn't that layer of corrosion that's sort of cold setting steel and aluminium parts together, we've got that nice boundary layer of grease to stop that happening. Time to slide that bearing in. It should be quite easy to fit in, so we're just going to make sure it's nice and square and falling into the hole. We don't want to push it sideways. We're going to take the drift tool, just gently push it in. It should just drift in. Now what we're going to do is double check from this side, and I can see that there is still a gap, so we are going to just have to tap it in to make sure that it's seated home. Again, make sure that the drift tool is nice and straight, because we want that load and that bearing to just sit square into the pedal body. You can almost hear the different sound as it seats in, but again, we're not going to just whack endlessly. We're just going to check that it's seated on this side, and it looks good. A little bit of extra grease, which we'll just drop in there. Time to move to the slide bearing, the igus one. Now, the igus slide bearing does have a nice chamfered edge on one side. So have a look at the bearing. We want the flat side to be out at us, sort of staring towards us, and we want the chamfered edge on the inside. The material of these is really clever because it is like a composite bearing material. It's designed to be really slidey and smooth, but you've got to be quite careful with how you drift it in. So again, make sure that you've got that layer of grease on the inside. Make sure that you're offering up the bearing nice and square. Then we're going to use a 10mm socket, which fits just nicely on the bearing. So this is really quite firm to get in. So just make sure that you're checking every now and then that it is going in square, because the material is quite soft. You can, well, be ham-fisted and just whack it in at an angle. And that's not great because the whole igus bearing will be off at an angle, and well, your pedal won't spin smoothly. So make sure that you double check, look from a couple of different angles to make sure that it's seating nicely. As you've drifted the bearing in, just double check that you can see that it's fully seated up against the pedal body. You might have to kind of have a look at both angles, but this one is seated really nicely. Can you tell what time it is? It's reassembly time. Make sure that all the parts are nice and clean, and now it's the fun bit. Bit like Lego, but well, just more fun because it's bike related, isn't it? So we're just going to take the pedal spacers and pop those in. I do one side at a time. We've got the wing assembly, and you'll notice that one side sticks out more than the other. And again, we've got a top hat that's bigger and a top hat that's slimmer, so I know you can do the maths. We want that one, just in that one, snuggle one in there, and that'll just, you'll be able to push it in and feel it seat in. This one is a little bit fiddlier, so we'll do one side, then we'll do the other, and then we'll slide them together. Again, make sure it's all aligned. Time to put the pedal body retention pins back in. Axle time! We've not had to disassemble any of the bearings because they're Enduro ones, so we know they've got a high fill. But if you've had to do that, then you've probably used your speed grease already. I haven't had to use it yet, but the axle is a really good application. So we're going to just put a little drop on there. We're going to rotate it around because what I do is I tend to put the seals, the outer and inner lip seals on now before I plug it into the body. So the first one you need to put on is the outer body. So just slide that one on. If you've got excess grease on that side, just make sure you transfer it to the inside. The double lip inner seal. So you want the kind of cone shapes of these to be pointing out. So that helps block any mud or dirt ingress. So again, slide that on. It should be quite a tight fit. Again, it might trap some of the grease, but we just squeeze out any excess. What I do again is slide it just up on the kind of tapered edge of the axle, just on this side next to, well, which would be the crank side. I'm going to take our axle and carefully insert it into the pedal body with the new bearings. It should feel nice and tight. As you tighten the axle in and tighten everything up, you might hear a popping sound, and that depends on how hog wild you went with how much grease you put in there. If you put loads and loads, as the axle fits in and all of the parts seat together, sometimes you can get excess grease porting out. Sometimes it can pop out here, either side of the pedal body, the wings here, or it can just pop out the side here. Just wipe off the excess, and before we put the end cap on, it is really tempting to pour or fill this void with lots of grease. And I say it's tempting because it is a bit of a messy task. You've got the grease out already and you're like, I know, I'll just put more in because that'll make it better. From experience, let's not do that. And I'll tell you why. We've got really sensitive Enduro cartridge bearings. We know that they're full of grease because Enduro do that. And if we fill this void on one side with lots and lots of grease, we're going to try and force grease through these seals, and it can almost blow the seal off one side, which means in wet and really crusty conditions, you're not going to have the optimized sealed bearing. So yes, do put a dab on there, but don't go wild. But yeah, fresh end cap time now. With everything back together, time just to give it a wipe off because you don't want any excess grease anywhere because that'll just attract dirt and dust. Check that everything works the way it should. Hopefully nothing is untoward. Shouldn't be if we follow these step by steps. We're halfway through the task, maybe time to get a cup of tea and service the other pedal. Your pedals are going to be different if they're not Crankbrothers, but I feel like all of the things we've talked about in terms of making sure that we've got fresh bearings, making sure that the bearings that are pushed in are in nice seats in terms of they've got good grease behind them, the axle's greased, seals are fresh, works on all different pedals. Keeping your pedals in peak performance is, well, mildly messy, but a relatively simple task. And hopefully this walkthrough has helped guide you through what things you can do to keep your pedals running as best as they can. Because without pedals, well, we're just sort of like balancing along, aren't we? We're taking away the joy of mountain biking. If you've got any extra tips on how to best maintain your pedals, let us know in the comments below.